Hey, this is Arial 10, and in this video, I'm going to be going through my remix of Ojos Tristes, beautiful song by Selena Gomez, The Marias, and Benny Blanco. And one thing I learned when remixing this is the song is actually an interpolation by Jeanette, one of the top Latin pop singers in the 80s. So this song does have a lot of history. Now, I've been a pretty big fan of The Marias for a while now, and I think they do an incredible job of weaving in kind of chill and dancey elements. And I kind of wanted to build a track that elevated those sounds and had something more appropriate for a dance floor. So I'm going to walk you through the different elements that I think make this song special. And whenever you're doing a bootleg remix, I think one thing you have to be very mindful of is the sample manipulation. So let's start there. One thing that I've really learned when doing bootlegs is not to try to fight the limitations of your machine or the sample itself. You know, there's only so much saving you can do, especially a song like this has a fair amount of reverb. It's got this kind of like roomy effect to it in the music. Honestly, vocal removers are not that good at treating this kind of music yet. So when you have a sample, you're gonna get all these artifacts, all this random noise in the background. And what I've kind of learned is not to try to fight it. Like if I take off all of the effects here, you can hear how that's without any processing. You can hear how dull it sounds in certain areas. You can feel how misshaped kind of the waveform is. I think there's some things you should do, like for example, I'll add soothe to get rid of some of the S's. I will have a lot of EQ. I'll compress it afterwards. A lot of the ordinary stuff, I also think you heard there that it was kind of lacking a little bit of mid, so I'll definitely add OTT and saturation. But at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do with the sample. And that's something I've really learned. And another good example is in the verse here, there's this like hopping synth sound, right? And a lot of times if you want to get rid of a sound, you'll EQ it, you might like cut different parts of the waveform, you might chop it up, but it's kind of like an offbeat sound, but it's still layered on top of the underlying pads, right? So I can't get rid of one without really harming the other. So rather than try to like do a lot of clever producing, just like live with it, right? If this came on at a club or something, like you'd probably be able to tell that it's some kind of remix. But I don't think that's a problem. I actually think you get around that with clever songwriting. You know, rather than have another interesting melody here, I just let that sit. You know, I'll add strings or something else rather than try to obscure that sound, which is something I might have done earlier in my producing days. Another key element you'll see with regards to the sample is the vocal chop. And I love using vocal chops. I'll just show you the beginning, the intro. The vocal chop actually takes up so much space. And one thing that I've also learned is not to overcomplicate vocal chops. The human voice has so much texture, it has so much information in it that if you try to, you know, have a really complicated melody, I think more often than not, you're gonna struggle to make it sound musical. At least for my style of music, I just like to follow the chord structure. But if I take out the vocal chop, you can see how empty this sounds. The same applies for the chorus as well. If I take out the vocal chops, it kind of just feels like a very ordinary sounding track. Now I think there's a few reasons for this. One is the energy that you get from a repeated sound. It's like why hi-hats add so much energy, because they're always there, they keep it moving. I think a vocal chop, if you repeat it like this, or a lot of the stutter effects that you might see, they're trying to accomplish the same thing. The other reason is because this occupies a decent amount of space in the frequency range. Pretty much all of the mids and the upper mids and the highs are being elevated by this sound. And as you saw there, I like to do a little bit of EQ to like spread it out a bit. I'll take down the mono aspect a little bit and then boost the stereo a little bit. But if you think about the actual melody that this is playing, it's quite simple. It follows the chord structure. I'll do the occasional octave jump just to keep things interesting. And because it's playing the same note, I often want to accentuate that. Here I just doubled it, and then I also brought the formant down with Little Altar Boy. So the next thing I want to talk about is the synth stacks. I actually really love the sounds here. And I think with this kind of music, I almost consider it like a dream pop house. You know, I want to make sure that the vocals are definitely audible, and I want to create a bed of sound around it to accentuate it even further. And that's kind of what you can see here. I like to use these like filtered sine waves or brass sounds. Brass sounds, I think, are a great compromise because they have a little bit of that like retro feel, but they still take up a lot of space in the mids, and they're very pleasing. If you have sustain on them, if you are just like holding chords, they're going to kind of taper off in a very pleasing way. And the other thing with saw stacks here is that I will add a little bit of like little micro shift, sometimes a little bit of phaser, and definitely just like a little bit of widening. I know that some people have issues with regards to phase if you use a widener. I think the key here is just like use it tastefully, you know, don't overdo it. I personally try not to use it on some elements, like I would never use it on a kick or like bass. It definitely frightens me a little bit, but on something like pads or like supporting chords, I think it's fair. Now, the other interesting thing I'll point out is something I've been doing recently, which is adding just a pure layer of noise. It's just like this warm noise, and I've cut out a lot of the highs and the lows. One thing I realized is that if you want to make your songs louder, which I think a lot of us do, a lot of the gap is coming from this kind of section, the lower mids, and then the mids itself, because there's not always going to be naturally a lot of information there. So what a lot of producers do, I think, is just layer on this like fake noise almost, right? You can't even really hear it in the context of the mix, but if you were to hear it live, you might like feel it with your chest almost. And I'll show you something that I also like to compare. This is an oscilloscope on the master chin. You can see that it's pretty full right now, but if I were to take out the synths, you can see quite a bit more gaps here. And it's nothing crazy, but I think that's where you're able to flesh out some of the waveform a bit more. That's because the kick itself, it's quite rhythmic, you know, it's hitting and it is taking up a lot of space, but it's not always there. So you can get that bigger waveform through these like sustained elements. Now, the other really interesting thing I think is using this approach for bass as well. And I mean just layering the different components. I think the lower mids is another area that's like really hard to get this nice punchy sound, especially if you're like me and your bass lines kind of like hop all over the place. The issue with doing a bass line like this is that if you have octave jumps, that higher octave note is not going to have the same level of information. That's because you're jumping up an octave, it's in a different part of the frequency range. And it's not perfect, but one thing you can do is just layer it. For example, this bass line, its only purpose is to raise the frequencies in this small range. Then I also have this one, which is just the sub. The sub's purpose, of course, is only to generate information in the sub. And I also like to have this like higher level. It's like super bit crushed, so it sticks out a little bit more. It's a bit more pokey, and I make sure this is completely mono, so it's not taking away from those other mid elements. And then together you kind of have a more like violent and aggressive sound. And I would say those are the main elements of the song. And I think there's a lot of room to create music like this, where it's kind of still evocative. It's based off like a dreamy ballad, a dreamy pop song, but it still has kind of like the fundamental groove of a house track. So I hope you enjoy this version as much as I do. The full version is on my SoundCloud, and I will see you in the next video.